Without waiting for her husband to return from his business trip, the wife decided to go to her mother-in-law's country house. And when she saw a homeless man with a little girl in his arms on the train, Lenora noticed this odd pair as soon as she entered the car. A young man and a girl of about 5, who was peacefully sleeping, nestled against his shoulder. The man's appearance was strikingly similar to that of a vagrant. His clothes and shoes were worn, his face drawn and weary, with tousled locks. A strange mix of pity and anxiety pricked Lenora's heart. Poor thing, how does he manage with such a little one, she thought, settling by the window and placing her travel bag on her lap. Along with a change of clothes and a couple of books, the bag held her drawing supplies, not for professional use, but as a hobby. She liked to make quick sketches in a notebook with pencils or experiment with watercolors. And now, with autumn in full bloom, it was the perfect time to grab her paints and create. Her mood was, to put it mildly, at an all-time low. Her husband was delayed again on his business trip. Ran into a few issues. "I'll be back in a couple of days," Max had texted, turning her weekend into a bitter disappointment. Few issues that had already stretched into a week, and to Lenora, they didn't seem like work problems at all, but something far more unpleasant, like infidelity. She struggled to hold back tears that threatened to spill, dreading the thought of breaking down right there on the train. Her decision to go to her mother-in-law's country house was spontaneous and unannounced. Ravenna had gone on and on about her lovely cottage in the rural quiet, a little garden, an orchard, and flower beds that were a source of local pride. Lenora had never actually been to this cottage. After all, she was a schoolteacher, weekends were hardly hers to enjoy. Stacks of notebooks, lesson prep, and constant contact with parents who thought their child's grade was too low left her with little time. But now, autumn break had arrived, and Lenora finally had some free time. The train slowly gathered speed, carrying her further from the city and her cozy apartment, now echoing with broken dreams. The car was filled with an atmosphere of dreary routine. Some passengers were reading, others were solving crosswords, while a few nodded off. But most, as usual, were glued to their smartphone screens, scrolling and liking. Feeling out of place among them, Lenora leaned against the window, watching the blurred scenery of trees, houses, and fields flash by in a gray blur, mirroring her own low spirits. Outside, light rain was beginning to fall, making it seem as if the train itself was crying, washing the windows with its tears. Trying to distract herself from her sadness, Lenora glanced again at the stranger with the little girl. The man, as if sensing her gaze, looked uncomfortable, and for a moment, his eyes showed something like a silent plea for help. Lenora blushed involuntarily. Her upbringing wouldn't allow her to ignore someone else's troubles. "Can I help you?" she asked gently. The man gave a slight nod, still looking at his sleeping daughter. "She's cold. We could use something warm." Lenora immediately understood. The little girl wore a thin, worn sweater that clearly didn't provide enough warmth in the chilly car. "Just a second," she said, taking out a warm shawl from her bag, one her grandmother had knitted for her long ago. It was especially handy when Lenora went out to sketch in nature. She could wrap it around her shoulders to keep warm. "Here, wrap her in this," Lenora offered, handing the shawl to the man. The man gratefully accepted, carefully draping it over the girl. Feeling the warmth, the little one smiled in her sleep and tucked her hands under her chin. "What's her name?" "She's so sweet," Lenora whispered. "Katie," the man replied, and after a brief pause, added, "And I'm Dylan." Lenora nodded and introduced herself as well. For a moment, a silence fell between them. "Are you traveling far?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation going. "Well, I'm not really sure myself," Dylan replied, looking a bit embarrassed. "We're just going wherever the train takes us. We'll see what happens next." "I'm headed to a village," Lenora said. "To my mother-in-law's cottage. Maybe you'd like to come with me?" Dylan hesitated. "I don't know, it feels a bit awkward. I'm a stranger to you, and I doubt your mother-in-law or husband would be thrilled about it." "Don't worry, it'll be fine," Lenora insisted. My mother-in-law has been complaining for ages that she needs a man's help around the cottage, and her son is always too busy. Plus, she could play with Katie. She's been wanting grandkids from me, but that hasn't happened yet." Dylan looked at his new acquaintance, and a glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. "Thank you so much." "Oh, it's nothing, really," Lenora replied. At that moment, Katie woke up. She looked at Lenora and, still rubbing her sleepy eyes with her hands, whispered, "Hello." "Hi, Katie," Lenora replied. "Katie, we're going to this lady's cottage." "Her name is Lenora," Dylan said. "Wow, that's awesome." "It's like an adventure," Katie said, fully waking up with excitement. Lenora smiled. She felt that helping these two was the right thing to do. Besides, her own problems had momentarily taken a back seat. She felt a warm sense of compassion and a desire to help. The journey passed quickly. Despite Dylan talking quite a bit, Lenora still couldn't quite understand how he ended up on the streets, what his childhood was like, or if he knew his parents. Soon, their stop came into view, and the passengers in the car started chatting excitedly. The sky was gray, mirroring Lenora's mood, and a light, annoying drizzle forced people to seek shelter under their umbrellas. Following Lenora, Dylan picked up Katie and headed for the exit. Luckily, the walk wasn't long. Lenora led them along a familiar path lined with leaning fences and fading gardens. There was only one way from the train station to the village, so it was impossible to get lost. The trees had already shed their leaves, and the red and yellow leaves rustled faintly underfoot. The scenery was beautiful here, and if it weren't for the rain, Lenora would have stopped to make a few pencil sketches. After a few minutes, the first houses appeared, looking like twins, low with tiled roofs and carved shutters on the windows. "And here's our cottage," Lenora said, double-checking the address on a small piece of paper, pointing to a small house nestled in the shade of a huge maple tree. Dylan nodded in agreement, making sure Katie was warm. But for some reason, there was no one home, the door was unlocked, and a quiet stillness filled the place, creating a sense of emptiness. "That's odd," Lenora muttered, feeling a pang of worry in her chest. Ravenna was supposed to be home. "Maybe the address is wrong?" Dylan suggested cautiously. But Lenora dismissed the thought immediately when she saw her mother-in-law's coat and jacket hanging on the rack in the hallway. Suddenly, the gate in the yard creaked. Lenora stepped to the door, hoping, but shook her head in disappointment. Standing by the gate was a curious neighbor, a woman who looked to be around 70 or so. "You must be Lenora? Ravenna's told me a lot about you," the elderly woman began. "Yes, that's me. I decided to visit, though without any warning." The neighbor clasped her hands. "Oh, what bad luck. Ravenna went into the forest about an hour ago to pick mushrooms. She said she wanted to can a few jars for winter." "Mushroom picking?" Lenora asked in surprise. "And when is she expected back?" "Who knows," the woman shrugged. "The forest here is plentiful, lots of mushrooms. She might be back by evening." Lenora felt uncertain. Truthfully, she was uncomfortable staying in an empty, unfamiliar house, especially with people she barely knew. But she couldn't just leave them out in the street either. Come in," she invited them into the house. "We'll put the kettle on since the hostess isn't here. Let's sit down and rest." "Thank you," Dylan nodded, still holding Katie in his arms as he stepped inside. Lenora set the kettle on the electric stove, then, feeling a bit awkward, found some honey in a wooden jar, pastries, and raspberry jam that her mother-in-law had made earlier in the summer. Yet, her concern for Ravenna only grew. She wasn't young anymore, and anything could happen, even though the forest was close by. The whistle of the kettle pulled Lenora out of her worried thoughts. "Well, here we go, let's have some tea to warm up." Dylan and Katie thanked her warmly and started enjoying the treats. Lenora watched her guests secretly, feeling an inexplicable sense of tenderness. Dylan seemed very quiet, almost reserved, while Katie was curious and eagerly answered all her questions. "Katie, did you know I love to draw?" Lenora remembered her hobby. Would you like to see my drawings? Of course. Lenora smiled and took a watercolor sketchbook out of her bag. Here, take a look. She showed the girl the landscape of an autumn forest. What do you think? Katie stared at the drawing in awe. It's beautiful. Did you draw all of this yourself? Lenora smiled. Yes, I did. Would you like to learn to draw like this too? Katie nodded eagerly and gave a thumbs up. Delighted by her enthusiasm, Lenora immediately handed her some colored pencils and a blank sheet of paper. At first, Katie was a bit shy, just moving the pencil around on the page, but soon she became absorbed in drawing, forgetting about everything else. Meanwhile, Dylan sat quietly to the side, occasionally glancing out the window, clearly anxious for the hostess's return. He's probably worried, Lenora thought. Who knows how they'll react to him, whether they might even turn him away with his child. But Ravenna was still nowhere to be seen. Foraging for mushrooms takes time, of course, but the days are shorter in autumn, and it's all too easy to get lost in the evening shadows. Maybe we should go look for Ravenna? Lenora suggested to Dylan after Katie had fallen asleep again. She saw the worry frozen in his eyes. To be honest, I was thinking the same. It's probably best to go and check. After covering the sleeping Katie with a blanket on the couch, Lenora headed for the door. The autumn forest, damp and silent, felt dark and mysterious. Leaves in shades of red, yellow, and crimson rustled underfoot, as if whispering secrets. Lenora led the way, occasionally calling her mother-in-law by her name. The sky, heavy with dark clouds, loomed overhead, occasionally shedding drops of rain that trickled down her face, sending a slight shiver through her. Clutching a flashlight she had taken from the house, Lenora walked along the narrow forest path, feeling as gloomy as the sky above. The thought that Ravenna might be lost kept gnawing at her. She also felt guilty, as she was the one who had invited Dylan and Katie to join her at the cottage, though she wasn't even the owner of the house. Maybe I shouldn't have done that, a worried thought flashed through her mind. They had been walking for half an hour, pushing through bushes and stepping over fallen trees. Lenora, used to the quiet of her own apartment, felt uneasy in the forest's silence. Dylan, she asked, are you good at finding your way in the woods? Well, in a way, Dylan replied. As a kid, I often wandered through the forest looking for berries and mushrooms. I used to love the forest too, Lenora admitted, but in recent years, I hardly have time for anything. I'm a schoolteacher, surrounded by kids, but I don't have any of my own. Dylan nodded sympathetically. I understand. Children have a good sense of the forest, they aren't even afraid of it at night. Katie must be missing us, Lenora said, thinking of the little girl. She'll be happy to see us soon, Dylan replied. Katie loves the forest. Suddenly, Lenora felt a wave of weakness wash over her. Despite the raincoat draped over her shoulders, she was soaked through. I think I'm freezing, she whispered. Hold on a little longer. We'll find Ravenna, and you can warm up, Dylan said gently, switching to a more familiar tone and resting his hand on her shoulder. The touch felt warm and comforting to her. They continued walking slowly, listening to the sounds of the forest. Suddenly, a small lake appeared ahead, resembling a forgotten saucer left by a giant. A moment later, Lenora noticed a human figure leaning against an old birch tree. It was definitely a woman, swaying back and forth, struggling to keep her balance, but soon she sank to the ground, dropping a basket of mushrooms from her hands. There she is, by the tree. Ravenna! Lenora shouted, running up to the tree. Ravenna, can you hear me? She leaned over her mother-in-law, trying to bring her around. Ravenna was sitting against the tree trunk, her face pale, and her lips had turned blue. Lenora, what are you doing here? The woman asked in surprise, attempting a weak smile. What's wrong with you? Lenora, in a panic, grabbed her mother-in-law's hand. You look so unwell. My heart, Ravenna wheezed, and her hand went limp. Dylan, please help. Dylan quickly examined Ravenna, and something unusual flashed in his eyes, something beyond understanding. In that moment, he seemed nothing like a vagrant, but someone fully aware of the gravity of the situation. "We need to start chest compressions immediately," he said calmly, without a hint of panic. "Her pulse is barely there. It may have stopped." Lenora gasped in fear, covering her face with her hands. Meanwhile, Dylan laid Ravenna on her back and began performing CPR. Lenora watched in horror. She had never seen anything like it before and had thought only doctors knew how to do such procedures. Ravenna still showed no response. "We have to do something," Lenora whispered, looking at Dylan in despair. "Don't worry," he said with a calm confidence in his voice. "This is just the beginning. It's supposed to take a little time." Lenora, still in shock, couldn't understand how he could be so composed while trying to save someone in these conditions. But there was no other choice. This was all they could do. Dylan continued with the compressions. The minutes stretched on, feeling like an eternity. Desperation peaked, and even Dylan began to wonder if he could save the unfortunate woman. Even experienced medics sometimes fail. Was this one of those times? Suddenly, Lenora, watching her mother-in-law's face, saw a hint of color return to her cheeks, and a faint breath escaped her lips. "She's breathing!" Lenora cried out. "Yes," Dylan exhaled with relief. "But she's still unconscious. What should we do next?" Lenora asked, her hands trembling uncontrollably. "We need to call an ambulance," Dylan said, "and carry her to the village. An ambulance can't get through here." Lenora quickly took out her phone and dialed. "Hello, we have an emergency. Heart issues. A woman, 62 years old. Please come quickly." "Emergency received," came the response. "Where are you located?" Lenora immediately explained their location. "The emergency vehicle should be with you in about 10 minutes, the dispatcher replied before ending the call. Looking at Dylan, Lenora asked shyly, "How are we going to carry her?" "Don't worry, I'll take care of it," Dylan reassured her. A minute later, Lenora couldn't believe her eyes as she watched the vagrant gently lift Ravenna in his arms and carry her. "Thank you, Dylan," she whispered. "No need to thank me," he replied, his eyes shining with kindness. "The most important thing is that she'll live." "Yes, and it's all thanks to you." Dylan carried Ravenna through the forest as if she were a child. Despite the damp autumn air, Lenora felt warmth spreading through her heart. She realized that in this dark, rainy forest, she had not only found help but also a renewed hope that sometimes the people you least expect can be the ones to lend a hand. Soon, the village came into view, and the lights of the ambulance appeared in the distance. Dylan quickened his pace and within minutes handed Ravenna over to the paramedics. "Well done, young man. I heard you even managed to get her heart going again," the emergency doctor said with respect. Dylan looked down modestly. "It just happened by chance." The doctor chuckled. "Well, you'd know best. All I'll say is, may you have more of those good chances in your life. It'd mean less work for us." The doctor shook Dylan's hand and climbed into the ambulance. Lenora stood a short distance away, watching the ambulance drive off, silently praying that her mother-in-law would pull through. She initially wanted to go to the hospital with them, but the doctor firmly declined, saying she could visit the next morning. Ravenna needed to rest after the episode. "Well, shall we head back?" Lenora sighed sadly. On the way, she tried calling Max 3 times, but his phone was off. After some thought, she sent him a voice message explaining the whole situation. When her neighbor Anna heard what had happened, she looked at Dylan with newfound respect, seeing him less as a vagrant and more as a hero. "Lenora, why don't you come over for dinner? Bring the little girl along. I've baked a chicken pie that's out of this world." Lenora glanced at Dylan, wondering if he would accept or decline, but he gladly accepted the invitation, as he was quite hungry after their trek through the forest. By the time they arrived, Katie had already woken up and was sitting at the table with a pencil in her hand. She'd loved Lenora's sketches so much that she decided to learn to draw just as well. The autumn air, filled with the scent of forest leaves and damp earth, felt thick and heavy. Lenora, still shaken by the events of the past few hours, walked alongside Dylan to Anna's house, holding Katie's small hand. Ravenna's hospitalization had stirred up a whirlwind of emotions within her: fear, relief, gratitude, and an indescribable feeling that she couldn't quite define. Anna's house smelled pleasantly of baked goods and chrysanthemums, a bouquet of which stood in the entryway. "Well, finally, you're here. I was beginning to think you'd changed your mind," the hostess exclaimed with visible relief. "It's nice to have visitors. Come in, come in. Have some coffee and try a slice of pie. Dylan, don't hold back either." "Thank you very much," Lenora replied, trying not to show her embarrassment. Katie, curiously examining the cozy interior, cheerfully ran to the table, where a plate of delicious treats was already waiting. With a cup of coffee in hand, Lenora shared with Anna the story of how she met Dylan and Katie on the train and how he had saved Ravenna. "And where did you learn those skills, Dylan?" Anna asked. "Oh, it's a long story," he replied. "You'd better ask me about herbs. I know them much better than anything else, trust me on that. Sometimes they work better than any pills." "Really?" "My joints are a disaster," Anna said, rubbing her hand as she sat down. "Each year, it just gets worse and worse." "Well, I could try to help," Dylan offered. "There's a wonderful decoction that can relieve pain and reduce swelling." "Oh, you even know how to make it?" the hostess asked, looking at him hopefully. "Yes, exactly," Dylan nodded. "You should also drink a brew that strengthens cartilage tissue and reduces inflammation." "Go on, tell me more," Anna urged. "Herbs," Dylan began, "aren't just plants. They're nature's healers, holding secrets about our bodies. They can restore, strengthen, and soothe. The key is knowing how to gather and use them properly." "I believe you, I do," Anna said. "After all, you saved my neighbor, Ravenna." Dylan hesitated a bit, then continued. "I used to be a doctor in a ward for the seriously ill." "A doctor?" Lenora and Anna exchanged glances. Dylan nodded. "Yes, a doctor, and I secretly treated everyone with herbs behind the chief doctor's and department head's back. Sometimes even without the nurses knowing. Patients recovered faster than with traditional methods. But medicine has come so far now. How did it come to this?" Lenora asked, frowning slightly. "Yes, I don't dispute that. Medicine has indeed advanced by leaps and bounds," Dylan replied with a bitter smile. "But sometimes, conventional methods don't work, and herbs, they're the ancient magic of nature." "Magic?" Lenora asked, surprised. "Like a shaman?" "No, not at all. I just know how to harness the power of plants. I studied medical texts from past centuries and learned about plants' properties. I memorized my grandfather's notes on herbs. He was a renowned herbalist. If it weren't for poachers, he would have easily lived to 100, maybe even longer." "And why aren't you a doctor anymore?" Anna couldn't hold back. For a moment, an awkward silence filled the room, and even Katie put down her piece of delicate pie. "Because I couldn't break my oath as a doctor," Dylan sighed heavily. "I saved the life of a woman everyone wanted to abandon without help." "And what happened?" Lenora looked at him with curiosity. "Her name was Darcy. She was pregnant," Dylan said slowly, as if reliving the events. "She wasn't supposed to give birth because a rare genetic condition left her almost no chance. All the doctors agreed that she would die and take the baby with her, but I somehow sensed that I could help her. I gathered rare herbs, made a special brew, and a miracle happened. Darcy gave birth, though a month early, to a healthy baby girl. She named her Katie. And 3 days later, Darcy died from complications." "So Katie," Lenora looked at the little girl with amazement. Dylan nodded. "Yes, Katie is that very little angel saved by those herbs. They gave her mother the strength to deliver. Without them, she might not have been born at all. There was still the option of a C-section, but no one wanted to take that responsibility. And what happened next? Lenora was still trying to make sense of it all. At a medical board review, I was labeled a criminal, Dylan sighed. I was sentenced to 3 years in prison and banned from practicing medicine for 5 years afterward. When I was released, I took Katie from the orphanage in memory of Darcy. Her husband had abandoned her, blaming the baby for his wife's death. They didn't want to let me take her, so I even had to enter a fake marriage to make it look legitimate. Wow. I see, Lenora whispered. That's a huge sacrifice. Katie is all I have, Dylan replied. She's my daughter, even if not by blood. I was married before going to prison, but after the trial, my wife divorced me and took the apartment in the settlement. Now, from what I've heard, she's remarried, raising twins with a businessman husband, often traveling abroad. But I don't blame her. To each their own. Lenora listened in silence, realizing that this was no ordinary vagrant with a child, but a medical professional with a big heart and rare talent. A man who, despite everything he'd gone through, had retained his kindness and compassion. I don't know what I would have done without you, Lenora finally said. Thank you for everything, Dylan. Oh, don't mention it, he replied, giving a gentle smile to Katie, who was sitting beside him. I just did what I had to. In the quiet, broken only by the crackling of the fireplace and the soft rustle of the wind outside, Lenora felt she had learned more about this man in these moments than during the entire day. In this little log house, filled with the aroma of pie and autumn flowers, a warm feeling began to blossom in her heart. The evening passed in pleasant conversation. Dylan shared stories about the remarkable properties of herbs and how they could help with various ailments. Anna listened intently, asking questions with growing interest. Katie, after playing to her heart's content with Anna's cat, Marfa, climbed onto Lenora's lap and settled down quietly. Only when night fell did Lenora, Dylan, and Katie finally prepare to return to Ravenna's house. Please, come by any time. My door is always open for you. My kids left long ago, and my grandchildren are busy with their own lives. Who wants to spend time with an old lady? Anna said as she handed Lenora a paper-wrapped slice of pie. Oh, come now, Anna, you have plenty of life ahead of you, Dylan remarked. The hostess smiled. Say what you will, Anna said. I gave nearly a third of my life to the steel plant. Our products were known across the country. I worked as a workshop supervisor, and it took a toll on my health. Doctors tried to help me, treated me, but eventually advised me to move to a region with clean air, forests, nature. So here I am, alone in this remote place. Only Ravenna kept me company. We'd chat in the evenings and then go home. Lenora felt tears welling up as she imagined lonely autumn evenings spent in solitude. After saying goodbye to Anna, they returned to Ravenna's house. When the question arose of who would sleep where, Dylan chose an old, worn-out armchair in the living room. I'm used to conditions like these, you and Katie should take the bedroom. It's the right thing to do, he explained, catching Lenora's surprised look. She hesitated for a moment, then went to make the bed. It was late, and by rights, Katie should have been fast asleep by now. As soon as her head hit the pillow, she drifted off, but sleep eluded Lenora. Lost in her memories, she bit her lip painfully. Her maiden name was Wood. Her mother was named Sarah, her father, Victor. Her parents had met entirely by chance when Victor Wood was standing at a bus stop in his dress uniform after his military service, waiting for a bus to take him back to his hometown. The evening breeze was refreshing after a hot day, and Victor was watching the passing cars, daydreaming about peace and quiet after the bustling army life, reuniting with family, and finally pursuing his favorite hobby, photography. But as the bus was about to leave, he noticed a delicate girl struggling with an enormous suitcase, trying unsuccessfully to get it onto the bus. Without hesitation, he helped her with her luggage and learned that her name was Sarah. It turned out they were headed to the same town, a small industrial center in the south, known for its factories. This coincidence instantly drew them closer, and Victor felt a pleasant excitement he hadn't experienced in a long time. Through their conversation, he learned that Sarah had been an orphan from a young age and had traveled around the country searching for a better life and a job that would allow her to start anew. Although Victor had earned a small sum during his service, he was far from wealthy. All his savings were modest and wouldn't provide him with a comfortable life. During the journey, they warmed to each other and shared a genuine connection. After passing yet another town, Victor, gathering his courage, suggested that Sarah stay with him, well, not exactly with him, but in a rented apartment. His parents lived with his older brother and his family in a small country house on the outskirts, and he didn't want to inconvenience them. Sarah agreed, finding herself drawn to the strong, kind man with good posture and warm brown eyes. When they arrived in town, they spent a few days in a modest hotel near the train station. Then, pooling their modest savings, they found a small cottage in a quiet area near the city park. Victor, having gained driving skills in the army, decided to look for work as a truck driver in construction. Finding a job for Sarah, however, was more difficult. Not wanting to be a burden to her beloved, she tried to find work that would allow her to contribute to the family. She went to numerous companies but was unsuccessful. Finally, in desperation, Sarah decided to take a job as a cleaning lady at a local middle school. They decided to wait on a wedding. There was no rush, and happiness wasn't in the ceremony itself. Days turned into nights, and Victor and Sarah built a life filled with care, love, and respect. Victor tried to spend as much time with Sarah as he could, helping around the house and looking after her. In turn, Sarah filled Victor's life with warmth and joy, cooking delicious meals and creating a cozy atmosphere at home. They spent evenings over a cup of hot coffee, sharing their dreams for the future. Victor dreamed of opening his own photography studio to pursue his passion, while Sarah hoped to get an education and find a more prestigious job. One warm summer evening, Victor finally proposed. He prepared a romantic dinner outdoors, decorating the table with flowers and candles. When the dinner was over, Victor took Sarah's hand, looked into her eyes, and said the words she had been waiting for months to hear. "Will you marry me?" With tears of joy in her eyes, Sarah said, "Yes." Their wedding was simple but very touching, attended only by Victor's closest friends and family. Soon after, Lenora was born to the couple. From the very beginning, Sarah and Victor were exemplary parents, surrounding their daughter with love and care. They even bought an unrenovated apartment, leaving their old house as a country retreat. Unfortunately, their happiness was short-lived, and just 2 years later, tragedy struck the Wood family. Victor, while driving, was involved in a terrible accident. Lenora barely remembered her father's funeral. The only things that stayed with her were her mother's tear-streaked face and the solemn choir of women's voices during the service. Besides the emotional toll, Victor's death left a devastating impact on the family's finances, reducing their income by nearly 2/3. To provide a decent life for herself and her young daughter, Sarah had to work herself to exhaustion, taking on extra jobs after her cleaning shift at the school. Every day, Sarah left early in the morning and came home close to midnight, exhausted but not broken. She took on any work she could find, just to feed her daughter and provide her with what she needed. One cold winter evening, Sarah slipped on icy steps and fell awkwardly on her side. Struggling to make it back to her apartment, she collapsed into bed, and by morning, she awoke with a terrible chill and body aches. Her temperature was high, and her left hip, which had taken the brunt of her fall, throbbed painfully. As her condition worsened, little Lenora called for an ambulance. Tears streamed down her cheeks, and she couldn't imagine what she would do if her mother left her. An X-ray revealed that Sarah had a complicated hip fracture with displacement, requiring urgent treatment. It baffled everyone that she had managed to make it home at all. Unfortunately, the medical expenses quickly mounted, and Sarah had to withdraw all the money she and her late husband had managed to save. Lenora took care of her sick mother day after day, even feeding her with a spoonful of homemade noodle soup. "Get well soon, Mom. I know you're the strongest," Lenora would say, trying to hide her tears from her mother. Since Sarah worked as a cleaner at the school, Lenora decided to take on the heavy burden of cleaning the school building and corridors herself to prevent any issues with her mother's job. Sarah wanted to take official sick leave, but the principal threatened to retroactively fire her if she didn't find a replacement. So each evening, donning her mother's rubber gloves that reached almost to her elbows, Lenora took up the mop and carefully cleaned everything. She had to do this mainly in the evenings, as she attended the same school during the day and also cared for her mother. Most of the staff treated the young worker with understanding and compassion, offering her food, clothes, helping her with her studies, and overlooking her occasional absences, which were due to her responsibilities at home. They saw how hard Lenora was trying, and their hearts filled with pity for this delicate girl who carried such a heavy burden on her small shoulders. However, not everyone at school was willing to help. Maria Thornton and her friend Oprah, known for looking down on anyone poorer than themselves, never missed a chance to mock or insult Lenora. One day, the two of them deliberately broke her mop so she wouldn't be able to clean the floors properly. All of Lenora's hard work was ruined, but she gritted her teeth and held back her tears. She knew she couldn't cry or show weakness in front of these people. Only after the girls left, laughing mockingly, did she let herself cry. Wiping her tears, Lenora wondered why some people were so cruel to those who had less, who couldn't afford nice clothes and expensive things. After 3 months, Sarah recovered and slowly began to return to work. Lenora continued helping her mother for a while to make sure she was fully recovered and could ease back into her routine. Time passed quickly, in rhythm with the turning pages of her school report. Sarah continued working as a cleaner, and Lenora studied diligently, impressing her teachers with her knowledge. Lenora was very hardworking, and her grades were notably higher than those of her classmates. The only thing that clouded her life was the prejudice of some classmates who mocked her as the cleaner's daughter or the poor girl. They didn't realize how lucky they were to have loving parents who could provide for them. Lenora tried to ignore the hurtful comments, but sometimes they stung deeply. She often felt like an outsider. Still, Lenora believed in herself, in her bright mind and kind heart. She also understood that one day, she would prove to everyone who looked down on her that she was worthy of respect. After graduating, to the surprise of many, Lenora went on to study at a teacher's college, where she graduated with honors. But the most important part was yet to come. Almost as if in defiance of her former classmates, Lenora returned to work as a teacher at the very school where she had once cleaned floors. When teaching the children of her former bullies, she never blamed the kids for their parents' mistakes. Children are children, after all. You reap what you sow, nurture them with kindness, attention, and love, and you'll raise a worthy successor and helper in old age. Neglect their upbringing, and you'll raise a weed that brings only trouble. Lenora enjoyed her work at the school. Sometimes, staying late after the after-school program, she would walk down the hall, running her hand along the walls, remembering her childhood and the mop her classmates had broken. Then came her introduction to her future husband, Max, and their brief romance, which grew into something more than just passion. Ravenna, who had raised her son alone, had no objections to their marriage, though many of her friends doubted that Lenora was a match for a businessman. That being said, it wasn't as if Ravenna particularly loved her daughter-in-law. Not at all. Rather, she remained neutral, allowing the young couple to sort out their feelings on their own. It so happened that Sarah passed away just a year before her daughter's wedding, succumbing to complications from pneumonia. Only after becoming an orphan did Lenora understand what her mother must have felt. True, she didn't have to scrub floors now, and she hadn't had children of her own, but it felt as if a dark fate continued to follow her. In truth, her relationship with Max had been strained for half a year already. Endless business trips, late nights at work, and, most painfully, the traces of lipstick on his shirt collars and the scent of another woman's perfume. A woman's perfume, unmistakably. Max, trying to excuse himself, made up 100 feeble excuses that, at best, were laughable and, at worst, threatened their marriage. Now, once again, he had gone on a business trip, delayed not by an hour or two but by several days. But could this even be called a family life? "What don't you like, Lenora?" You have no money problems. Your husband is a promising businessman. What more could you want? Just live and be happy, said Max. I want children, a family like everyone else, children's laughter in the morning, the simple worries of family life, Lenora replied bitterly. Max shook his head. You keep going on about kids. But what for? Sure, they're the flowers of life, but let them grow in someone else's garden for now, okay? At least for a while. Ravenna rarely got involved in the young couple's arguments. She had lived a long life herself and knew all too well the meaning of the third wheel. Lenora managed to fall asleep only in the early morning. She dreamed of her former classmate, Maria Thornton, who was laughing infectiously, pointing with a broken mop at dirty streaks in the corridor. Lenora woke up screaming in a cold sweat. Her heart was racing as she realized it was only a nightmare, and she no longer had to clean up dirt under the mocking eyes of the entire class. As it happened, her scream had woken up Katia, who sat on the edge of the bed, looking at her kindly with worry. It's all right, don't worry about it, Lenora said, giving a slightly embarrassed smile. It turned out Dylan was already awake and up on his feet. Not knowing what to do with himself, he had fixed the crooked fence, split wood to have some kindling ready. Surveying the yard, he instinctively noted places that could use a man's strength and skill. There, the chimney had tilted to one side, and the shutters were barely hanging on. The well chain was rusted through, too, and the bucket needed replacing. In short, there was plenty to do. And it seemed that Ravenna's son either had no time to help his mother or had given up entirely, leaving her to handle everything on her own. But Ravenna wasn't 20 anymore. What if she had felt ill while mushroom picking and no one had been there? Well, all's well that ends well. Getting out of bed, Lenora washed up and prepared a simple breakfast before heading to the hospital. This morning was less gloomy. To avoid waiting for the train, she decided to call a taxi. The ride to her mother-in-law's passed quickly. Katia, captivated by the scenery outside the window, chatted nonstop, sharing her childish fantasies. Lenora, absorbed in her own thoughts, barely listened. She was very worried about Ravenna, wondering how she had made it through the night. Entering the hospital lobby, they made their way to the ward where her mother-in-law was. As they approached the closed door of the room, Lenora felt that something was wrong. The air in the corridor, thick with the smell of medicine, seemed heavier than usual. Her heart sank unpleasantly. "Lenora?" asked a nurse, a young woman with sad eyes who approached her. "Please, come in. I'm afraid I don't have good news. Ravenna fell into a coma 6 hours ago." Lenora froze in place, unable to say a word. A storm of emotions raced through her mind, fear, despair, anxiety, all swirling into one painful knot. "How is she?" Lenora asked barely above a whisper. "Is there any hope at all?" "The doctor says her condition is stable, but the outlook is grim." "She's very weak," the nurse replied, looking sympathetically at the patient's relative. But when Lenora opened the door, she froze in the doorway. The scene before her was so unpleasant that she literally couldn't breathe. Standing in the room were Max and, oh God, Maria Thornton, her former classmate who had always thought herself above others, humiliating and mocking Lenora during their school years. Maria, trying to look caring, held a pack of tissues in her hands. When he noticed Lenora, Max hurried to stand up, a flicker of what looked like guilt flashing across his face before it quickly turned back to his usual arrogance. "Hey," he nodded as if nothing had happened. "We came to visit my mother." "Max, what does this mean? You were supposed to be on a business trip, weren't you?" Lenora asked, still unable to believe her eyes. "Well, Maria was just helping me out. She called the hospital to check on Mom's condition," Max tried to explain. "We're just concerned, after all." "And what are you doing here?" Lenora couldn't hold back as she confronted her former classmate. "You've always hated me. You're probably glad Ravenna's lying here unconscious." Maria scoffed, giving Lenora a contemptuous smile as she said through gritted teeth, "Oh, stop it. I don't have any ill feelings toward your mother-in-law. I'm just as concerned about her as Max is. Honestly, we were already discussing the inheritance. Ravenna's not young, and it's sensible to consider a will in advance. Inheritance? Lenora couldn't believe her ears. How can you say that? She's still alive. How can you talk like that? What's wrong with that? Maria replied. Your mother-in-law might not recover. Get out of here, both of you, do you hear me? Lenora shouted. Calm down, Max said. Maria was just thinking out loud. Lenora still couldn't believe what she was hearing. The husband who had sworn loyalty to her was planning to divide his mother's assets while she was still alive, and with Maria, who had always hated her. I'm filing for divorce, Lenora said quietly. Dylan, hearing her words, nodded in agreement, though he kept his thoughts to himself. She knew he didn't need to speak his pain aloud. As a former doctor, he understood everything. Max hesitated, unsure of what to say. But Maria, unlike him, didn't falter. Go ahead, sweetheart. File for it. That's your right. Max and I will figure things out on our own. Lenora nodded, biting her lip painfully as she turned to look out the window. At that moment, the pair left the room, slamming the door behind them. After a moment, Dylan and Katia followed. Lenora was left alone with Ravenna. Sitting beside the bed, she took her mother-in-law's hand and began speaking to her softly. Struggling to hold back tears, Lenora began recounting everything that had happened over the past few days. Deep down, she felt that Ravenna could hear her, even if she couldn't respond. A month flew by unnoticed. During this time, many things changed in Dylan and Lenora's lives. With his record cleared, Dylan secured a job at a private clinic, where his talent and knowledge of the healing properties of herbs were greatly valued. Ravenna spent 2 weeks in a coma and finally awoke, drawn to the sound of a child's voice that guided her through a long, dark tunnel toward the light. The woman turned her head and saw little Katia, who was sitting on a chair, swinging her legs and reading a book to her. For Lenora, it felt like an eternity had passed since the day she saw Max with Maria in that hospital room. A month filled with the bitterness of betrayal and the pain of realizing that the world she believed in had collapsed like a house of cards. Lenora arrived at the courthouse, ready to finally put an end to this painful story and free herself from the bonds of lies and deception that had tied her to Max. Suddenly, a hunched figure appeared in the hall, causing Lenora to start. Ravenna, her mother-in-law, whose health and life had hung by a thread not long ago, was standing there, leaning on a cane, looking at her with tenderness. Ravenna, Lenora gasped, barely holding back tears. Her mother-in-law smiled weakly and, approaching her, took her hand, whispering softly, "Don't be afraid, dear, I'm with you." Max, noticing his mother in the courtroom, turned as pale as chalk. His face twisted in displeasure and anger. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "You're not supposed to leave the hospital," he hissed, ignoring his wife's presence. Ravenna, paying no attention to her son, addressed the judge. "Your Honor, may I say a few words?" The judge nodded, motioning her forward. "I am Ravenna, Max's mother, and I fully support my daughter-in-law Lenora's decision to divorce. My son is a man without honor or conscience. He betrayed my trust in his wife, who stood by him as he was just establishing himself in business. I hope the court makes a fair decision." Max paled even more. He clearly hadn't expected such a blow from his mother. "You have no right to judge me," he shouted. "But I do have the right to protect my family," Ravenna replied calmly. "Lenora deserves happiness more than anyone. She, unlike you, has a kind heart." The judge, listening to Ravenna's statement, made a few notes in his notebook, then turned to Lenora and Max. "Lenora, you have filed for divorce. Do you acknowledge Max's fault in infidelity and wish to divide the jointly acquired property?" "Yes, Your Honor," Lenora answered. "I acknowledge it and want to divide the jointly acquired property." Seeing that things were not going his way, Max tried to say something, but the judge interrupted him. "Max, do you have anything substantial to add?" I don't agree to the divorce under these conditions. This is outright robbery. You are attempting to manipulate the situation, the judge said sternly. Your words hold no legal weight. The court has ruled in favor of divorce and decreed that the jointly acquired property will be divided equally. In helpless anger, Max slammed his fist on the table. He had just realized he'd lost on all fronts. His plans for his mother's inheritance and for gaining complete freedom with Maria had collapsed. Applause erupted in the courtroom. Ravenna approached Lenora, touched her hand, and whispered, "You are so strong, dear, and you deserve true happiness." Dylan, who had been silently standing by all this time, embraced Lenora tightly. In the young doctor's eyes, she saw tenderness. "Lenora, I love you. Will you marry me now? I want you to be my wife and the mother of our children." Lenora froze in surprise. His proposal came like a bolt out of the blue. "Yes, I will marry you," she whispered. Katia, who had been sitting on their neighbor Anna's lap, clapped her hands in joy. For the first time in a long time, Lenora felt truly happy. Later, as she brushed her hand over a canvas during a visit to Ravenna's country house, she realized that even through pain and betrayal, the light of love always shines through. After all, it was on that very day, when her heart was shattered, that a person entered her life who picked up the pieces, healed her wounds, and gave her hope for a bright future.